Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Re-Federalist Report, where we look at current historical events from an original intent standpoint in the hopes of returning to our true Federalist roots. I am Brady, also known as the War Hamster in some crazy corners of the internet, and joining me today is my good friend Ron Partain and my other good friend Douglas V. Gibbs himself.
The Navy guys.
Yeah, the squids are in the room.
Yeah, I was going to ask you guys offline about how does a small little boat run into an aircraft carrier, but we get that another day.
It's because everything's electronic. They don't have eyes out there anymore like they used to.
Clearly the aircraft carrier can't be at fault.
I don't know. I thought they had like 1,000 miles.
You can't see the aircraft carrier coming and you're driving a tugboat, then you're in serious problem. You got some serious troubles.
Yeah, well, fortunately, that's not our topic for today.
Right. Exactly.
We do have a really fun topic today.
Yes, we do.
Today, we are going to start the first in probably a 3 or 4 episode series on the Confederate Constitution. And the reason we're doing this is, it's pretty important when we look at the founding documents. Doug and I recently looked at the comparison of the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution of the United States that we live under today. The Articles of Confederation are interesting because, well, they had 80 years of looking back at the Constitution to say, what did they get right? What did they get wrong? What did we like about it? What didn't we? And so we're going to find, as we go, we're going to go into the history that led up to the reason they wrote the Confederate Constitution. But we're also, you're going to see some things that are actually improvements on the U.S. Constitution, and there's a couple other things that may not be. But
to the untrained eye, a lot of the language is almost exactly as the Constitution, but then you start seeing these little differences and these little hybridization of a Confederation, Articles of Confederation into it.
Yeah, and it really gives you some insight into what those people, the framers of the Confederate Constitution, what they really cared about. And
right
from that, you can translate it and say, okay, why exactly did they secede in the first place? And, Doug and I have been doing these shows for a while. Ron absolutely had to be invited on this show because about 3-4 years ago, he brought up the Confederate Constitution to me. So he knows this topic really well, and there's no way I was going to do the show without him. So welcome.
Thank you, sir. Glad to be here.
Well, to get started, let's look at the, at the founding of the United States of America, there are a few different schools of thought of what the government should be. We hear people all the time talking about our democracy. And of course, you come back and say, well, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. But even that isn't technically correct.
Nope.
The Articles of Confederation was a confederation. It was a federation of sovereign states.
That's right.
When they formed the Constitution, they, basically created a general government, they called it. They didn't create a national government. When people say a republic today, they talk about a national government. That's just not what they intended. That's not what they said in the Federalist Papers. It's not what they said in the Anti-Federalist Papers. They were still a union of sovereign states. They took the confederation part out of it. When Ben Franklin said, a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. Technically, I can make an argument that wasn't correct.
Well, do we know that he even said that? Or is that just, legend?
Yeah, the conversation was mentioned once in somebody's writings in a conversation that Elizabeth Powell was having with somebody. And when they asked her about this meeting that had kind of gone around, the circles, and she then in that conversation gave her side of it, and then that person wrote it down. So we know about it only because she was asked about it later. And then even the story that we're told is different than what she relayed. The story we're told is they met on a hill just outside the Constitutional Convention, and actually it was in a building later, I believe, at the Powell House, where somebody asked her about her conversation with Franklin. So really our only evidence is what someone said, she said during a discussion later.
Well, it's certainly taken on legs of its own. And
absolutely.
Even some pretty well-read people will insist that we are a republic, and they say it in a way that we are a national republic. It's just like France is a national republic. It's one country. We were never intended to be anything of the sort of a national republic. In fact, the founding fathers feared the centralization of power in a central government. And even the proponents of the Constitution, some of them who were actually nationalists, everything they said in the Federalist Papers was, no, this is not what we're doing. So the Constitution, as ratified, was not a national republic. Now it became.
Well, if it was a national government, the states would have never ratified it.
No, not in a million years. But you had three schools of thought in the founding generation. You had the people who were called the anti-federalists, who were basically with the Federalists. They wanted to keep state sovereignty. You had the constitutionalists, people that wanted a little bit more central government. And they acted in good faith. That would have been a Madison, because they recognized the Articles of Confederation were too weak. And then you had the people that called themselves Federalists that were actually nationalists, led by Alexander Hamilton.
Well, Federalist Party and the left has been and when I say left, I mean left of the Constitution, has been doing this since the beginning of America, where they'll take a term and then hijack it. The only thing Federalist about the Federalist Party was the fact that they used the word Federalist in the name. And the reason why they did was because they knew that federalism was a popular thing.
Yeah.
And they wanted to convince everybody that's what they were when they weren't.
Yeah, the Republican Party had nothing to do with the Republic. It had to do with the Nationalists, and the Democrat Party has very little to do with democracy. But
in the beginning they did, but that changed toward a tyrannical direction. But democracy always does.
So there's some big issues, and we're going to do this at the 30,000-foot level because we've gone granular, the three of us, a number of times. But the big issues on the minds of the founders. First of all, they were worried about the centralization of power. They just fought a revolutionary war to get away from centralized power. Yes. They were concerned that the British Parliament was basically legislating rules in places they didn't live. There was no representation. One of the big ones was the mercantilism that they were experiencing, because companies like the British East India Company were getting beneficial legislations to profit their company at the expense of American producers or shippers. And this is crony capitalism, also known as mercantilism. It's a real big point that had a lot to do with secession and the Civil War. One of the things the Hamiltonians and later the Lincolnians would campaign on was things they wanted, like federally funded internal improvements and protective tariffs. And those are very damaging to the agrarian South. So it was actually set up for this.
And the antebellum period is filled with debates in Washington regarding the battle over that. And, it's interesting because even a couple of founding fathers, presidents who would be against that typically were signing bills that allowed for internal improvements by federal funding. One of the most famous vetoes of all time in 1817 is James Madison's, where he actually rejected it.
So we move.
Good.
Go ahead, Ron.
No, I was just going to say, I read a really interesting article yesterday. I did a show basically called the whitewashed tyranny of Abraham Lincoln, and it was basically I kind of read an article that had been written by somebody from about 10 years ago, and it was really interesting. A lot of the stuff that things that she put in that article. It was a good refresher for today. It was, the North basically was using the South as their piggy bank.
Exactly right.
With the tariffs and whatnot, what ultimately became the tariff of abomination, as they referred to it as. And the South was like, man, we've had enough of this. It's like, we're sending, you guys are basically taxing the hell out of us. And for all intents and purposes, it was a second time where you had taxation without representation, because in the North, especially in the Lincoln administration, after 1860, there was no representation from the South.
You're jumping ahead. You're absolutely correct.
My apologies.
No. That's the hardest part about doing the show with these two is reeling them both in.
my bad.
I've behaved. I've been sitting here.
You're getting better.
It makes it sound like I'm, recovering from, some horrible disease.
I'm sorry, it's just fresh on my mind. So
And the thing is, and now I'm really going to make a Warhamster mad. And the thing is, the North wasn't producing anything.
right,
They manufactured what the South was producing, and then they didn't allow the South to manufacture. And they were, in a sense, the ultimate parasite. The South, the North was.
Well, let's, like I said, you guys jumped ahead of it. Absolutely correct. But there's a little bit of history we have to go over first, and it really starts with the war.
You mean like how did it become that way?
well, can I?
No.
I just want to this kind of brings it home to where we are now.
Right.
I don't know if you guys saw the kind of the fervor the rage that's going on right now, because I guess Elon Musk tweeted about the parasitic class. There's a parasitic class of people in the United States, and it's basically it's the same thing that what the North was to the South. The North was parasitic of the South.
Yeah, it hasn't changed a whole lot since the 1860s. What we call mercantilism, what we called it then we decided to call it the American system hit America, and it's a system. And now we call it crony capitalism. Sometimes they call it fascism. It's all the same thing. It's the government picking favored industries basically at the cost of everyone else.
Mercantilism.
Yes.
By another name.
So we get back to the War of 1812, and what happened was Jefferson had put some tariffs on both England and France. They wanted to stay out of the wars, but those tariffs were hurting. And at the time, the South had the population advantage. They had the control of, at the founding, Virginia was the most populous state. This is not too much longer after that. The South had a little bit more political power than the North, especially with a small advantage in the Senate. But they put tariffs, and the vast majority of the trade of New England, their whole industry was, shipping. So with tariffs going up, they were losing money hand over fist, and they were so upset. Even during the middle of the War of 1812, they convened. It was called the Hartford Convention of 1815, and they were openly talking about secession and joining Canada.
Right.
Anything to add on that?
Well, I just find it odd that secession only suited the Yankees, if I can use the Brian McClanahan term properly. It only suited the Yankees when it benefited them.
Yep.
Well, you just described any left of the Constitution ideology. So
this idea of protective tariffs is problematic, but the other big part of mercantilism was what they call internal improvements, and that's using federal money to do things like at the founding days was build canals or roads, and the companies or entities that would get those contracts would make a ton of money. They were the favored people of the politicians, and of course they had a financial incentive to put their politicians in power to make sure they got those contracts. Same things that happens today.
So there's nothing new under the sun.
No. and then the states become dependent upon that money coming in ultimately, and then as we see in today's political society, then government uses that over their head to get them to do what they want.
As we get into the 1800s, it goes from canals and shipbuilding to railroads and steel. Mm-hmm. And as you will see, post-Civil War, that single-party rule by the Republican Party under that system of spoils and patronage, the biggest fortunes in the history of mankind, known as the robber barons, rose up. And basically, that's when you have a single-party rule, and you are you're the class that runs that party, and you're getting all the favors, the political favors, getting government-subsidized railroads. You are making a lot of money, and these robber baron families established generational wealth, and they pretty much still sit at the table and run the world today.
Now, the reality is that the United States prospered and became better out of it, but with every good comes a bad. With every pro there's a con, and so while who you're calling the robber barons, I don't necessarily like to use that term, but as you propel them as a bad entity, at the same time a lot of good came out of it. So there can be arguments on both sides about that time period.
Yeah, and they had we'll get to that when we get to the election of 1860. We'll talk a little bit more. We move forward in time, and we get a couple of big events happen. One is the Tariff of Abominations, and the other, of course, is the election of Andrew Jackson, right around the same time. Jump all over it. Which one do you want to do
Well,
first?
it's just, Hamilton, John Marshall, and Andrew Jackson. That's like the terrible threesome from the antebellum period. Hamilton launched it, and then Marshall and Andrew Jackson just carved out, what really became Hamilton's America.
And by that, you mean a much bigger general government or federal
Centralized power, all of that. Absolutely. And, it's funny because Andrew Jackson, the Whigs, joked and called him King Andrew. He essentially established a monarchy in the name of democracy. Where have you heard that before? He claimed he's the reason why the Electoral College got messed up. Everything was all about becoming more democratic. But see, by being more democratic, it fed him more power. And that's why the Whigs emerged. And the Whigs claim that the strongest branch of the government is not supposed to be the president, as Andrew Jackson was pushing, but that it should be the legislature. And so you had this battle that was forming, and he was, for lack of a better way of saying it, a very energetic president, like what we've seen, except for he didn't use his powers for good. And he basically just ramrodded everything he wanted through the system, and we never really recovered from that, and it really set the stage for the Lincolnian era.
Yeah, I want to share a screen real quick. Get a little bit of historical, show the balance of power. This shows the party divisions of Congress, and we're going to go back to about the late 1800s, where you can see the Democratic Republicans. This would be the Jeffersonians in the green. This is the Senate, and over here is the House, and in the pink is the Federalists. And after the election of 1800, you can see a huge shift towards the Democratic Republicans, and they would maintain that for the better part of 25 years. And
the Federalist Party never recovered, not only from the election of Thomas Jefferson, but the first thing Thomas Jefferson did is he fired the Federalist Party half of the bureaucracy, and they just never recovered from it.
Yeah, and every president, we went from Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, 8 years of each, all from the Democratic Republics. So that's 24 straight years. And then Jackson comes on, and they didn't call it the Democratic Party at the time. It's the Jacksonian Party versus the anti-Jackson is what this is calling it.
Yeah, well, that's when the Republican Party under Jefferson became the Democratic Republican Party, and then ultimately the Democratic Party.
What's interesting is you get through the 1830s. Over here on this section, you can see this thing called others in the House started to pop up. A third party started to have an influence. So at this time, we have the Tariff of Abominations, even though this is under a Jacksonian. And what that is basically a 47% tariff on basic goods like cotton in the South. Mm-hmm. And what that does is it means that the South couldn't export to England, nor could they import from Europe, because Europe is paying these heavy tariffs. They're going to lash back with tariffs of their own for their goods. And it was basically a punitive tax by the North on the South. Now, South Carolina is not having it. And
no.
Yeah, so we had a great showdown.
With Mr. Calhoun, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And basically said we're not going to do it. And this is what we call nullification. Does a state have the right to, basically say, fine, you can pass all your federal laws you want, but we're still a sovereign state, and we're just not going to have any of our state officers enforce your policy.
It created historically what is known as a nullification crisis, and the real question comes down to: was the nullification a constitutional nullification? Not just is nullification constitutional, but was what they did constitutional? In other words, were they trying to nullify a perfectly authorized federal law, or was it just because they didn't like it? And that's where James Madison got involved, and a lot of people believe that because of James Madison's writings that Madison was against nullification. No, he was against that nullification because he believed that the tariff was a perfectly authorized federal move.
I'm not sure it was, but the South sure as heck didn't.
Well, they sure as heck didn't like it, and it definitely set the stage for what we saw in the near future when it comes to the division and ultimately secession.
Well, but nullification was very successful because the North wasn't able to collect those tariffs, and they were able to get them down lower and lower and lower. There was
well, what happened was the other states in the South began to, get behind South Carolina and their support on this, and that's when nullification does work, is when the states work together on it.
Well, I didn't after Lincoln was elected. That was when Calhoun essentially negotiated a deal, and the people in the North, or Lincoln specifically, was like they just they couldn't have it. They're like, well, what are we going to do for our money? If we negotiate this deal, then all of our money's gone.
Yeah, the parasite's mouth would be separated from this.
Exactly.
Well, this issue heats up over the next few decades as they're going through the different inter-party strife. And slavery is an issue. There are very few northern states that still have slaves. Most of this, all the southern states.
And if you don't mind, real quick, slavery was such an issue. At the end of the First Amendment, it says, petition the government for redress of grievances. Communities, cities, counties would petition Congress back then. They would actually have these petitions and have a whole bunch of people sign it and then send them to Congress. And before Congress did any business, they would go through all the petitions. They were receiving so many anti-slavery, pro-abolition petitions that they actually just stopped going through the petition. It was too many, and they said, well, we got to do other business. Unfortunately, the concept of petitioning the government went away. We just quit doing it. But it shows you how big of an issue it was, that there were so many petitions coming in that Congress basically said, we can't do this anymore.
The other big issue, even more important than current slavery, because most people admitted that the Constitution did not allow Congress to ban slavery outright. That would have taken a constitutional amendment. Well, the big thing on the table was slavery in the new territories. Right. And that is a big fight. And you're going to see that really come up when we get into the 1860 election.
Well, if I remember correctly, there was they were at the time debating what we refer to as the 13th Amendment, which in reality was actually the 14th Amendment. They were debating this amendment to essentially what was the Corwin Amendment, or that they wanted to make that they actually wanted to amend the Constitution to make it so that no state could outlaw slavery. It was is that am I correct in saying that? Am I correct?
Yeah,
in how I'm wording
that?
It
was the 13th Amendment before the 13th Amendment and after the 13th Amendment, the one in between. Right. Exactly, they were trying to outlaw abolishing slavery, and because they knew that was on the horizon, and law wouldn't do it.
Yeah, and there's an important thing to understand. There's a big demographic shift happening once we get to the middle part of the 19th century. The South actually was very strong in the Senate because of the states were pretty much equally represented. But the House, which was more population driven, the North was getting more and more seats because basically a lot of the immigration came into the big cities of Boston, Philadelphia, New York.
Right. And the Missouri Compromise was an attempt to at least keep the Senate even.
Let me just show. I got the graph of the population, and it really kind of shows it a little bit. Here's from the 1860 U.S. Census. You can see the biggest states are now New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois. The first four are all bigger than Virginia, which was the biggest at the founding. Then you had Indiana, Massachusetts. The population disparity is pretty significant.
So and of course, you see all the deep South states are, basically like 12 and on.
Yeah.
And obviously, if you have the 3/5 clause, the slave population in 1860 was nearly 4 million. In 1800, it was just under 900 million. So that was growing too, but I don't know what the population was in the South. It
wasn't at the same rate because thanks to 1808, the Atlantic slave trade had been outlawed, and so the only new slaves were those born. And
yes and no. I mean,
there were about 13,000 that were smuggled into the United States. Absolutely.
Right, and
they
were actually smuggled in from the north.
That's true. Through Boston. But there's actually an effort legislatively in the 1840s and 50s to try to reopen the slave trade, and that's going to show up in these party statements we get into in a second here. The last
I just want to make a notation though that I think it's rather incredible to think that if you have a slave population of just under 1 million and it grows by basically 4 times without the importation of very many, I think that shows, or that's a reflection that the slaves were not treated nearly as poorly as what Hollywood tells us. Because
absolutely,
if they were beaten to death and worked to death, they wouldn't reproduce.
Right. So that's what was happening in Brazil. They were beating them to an inch of their life. It was a poor malnutrition, poor nutrition, poor living standards, and they were literally killing their slaves, and then they would have to import more. And that's the reason why, if you look at the records, Brazil has by far the most imported slaves during the slavery period. And it was because they had to replace what they were killing. Their slaves were not reproducing. You're not in the mood to reproduce when you're being beaten to an inch of and now, that said, there were some slave owners in the South that were absolutely cruel.
100%.
And the funny thing about it is, one of the worst offenders was a guy named Andrew Jackson.
Yeah. And just to kind of tie that up with a bow, if you analyze all of the records of all of the slaves that were taken from the African continent and brought to the Western Hemisphere, be it North, South, or Central/Caribbean, the amount of slaves that actually were brought into the United States was only 4% of people from the African continent. Only 4% of them ultimately made it to the United States.
Well, that's if you add the colonial period and the nationhood or countryhood.
That's right. Yeah. 100%.
Together. After 1776, it's about 2%.
Right.
And that was all gone by 1808 too. So
right.
Well, once again, yeah, exactly. And once again, though, about 13,000 were still smuggled in from Africa, directly from Africa. That's the number smuggled in from Africa. And then there were some others that were smuggled in from the Caribbean and Mexico. There was a lot of slaves that were actually being smuggled in through Mexico as well. But anyway.
So the big issue among the states they're battling out is whether there's going to be slavery allowed in the new territories. And Kansas is where this manifests itself. There's a big episode called Bloody Kansas, and you basically had Southerners trying to bring their slaves in, and Northerners who wanted free trying to stop that, and there was violence. Doug, you want to give us a little more granular?
Yeah, Bloody Kansas or Bleeding Kansas, both terms are used by historians. And basically what happened was with Kansas, they decided that to pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which nullified the Missouri Compromise. It basically said that no, if a state is not going to be determined on if they can have slavery or not have slavery based on their location. It's none of the federal government's business to determine that. Therefore, we're going to let the states determine that. Well, by letting the states determine that when they go to enter the union, that means that the state that has the larger population of pro-slave or anti-slave, that's what it's going to be. And people aren't stupid. They began to flock to that state, even if they had no intent to move west. A lot of people coming in from Missouri and different places. And then as the numbers remained close, and it got close to that time where they're going to be voting on becoming a state, then you started to see the real violence come in. And there are a number of stories about like a couple of brothers and families who were notorious for slaughtering people who were either pro-slavery or anti-slavery at the time. And it was, for lack of a better way, really the first battle of the war between the states. It really set the stage.
Well, and I think it's important to understand that when the North talked about being anti-slavery, it wasn't because of altruism that they were trying to defend.
This is a good point.
The black people. It was because they didn't want black people living among them.
Yeah, they didn't want this because they figured if the slaves were freed, they would go north looking for work.
Right.
and they didn't want that. And so there was a lot of Northerners that basically didn't want the abolition of slavery. They just wanted it contained. And if you look at the Lincoln-Douglas debates, that's what Abraham Lincoln actually ran on, is containment of slavery, not the abolition of slavery.
Well, actually, I just pulled that quote up. Let me read it real quick. And this is a quote from Abraham Lincoln during that debate. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters of the Negro or jurors, or qualifying them to hold office, of having them to marry with white people. I will say in addition that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I suppose will never, or will forever forbid the two races living together upon terms of social and political equality, and inasmuch as they cannot so live, that they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, that I, as much as any other man, am in favor of the superior position being assigned to the white man.
Yeah, great catch. That's very telling. And there's about a dozen more speeches that Lincoln gave over the prior 20 years. Remember, this guy's a railroad lawyer, and that's about as crooked of a job as you can have.
Mm-hmm.
And not only when you're trying to have a federally funded railroad go from point A to point B,
which is totally unconstitutional.
Absolutely, but you've got to have people give up their land, and these people want to do it, and you're going to have to do it at the best price you can negotiate. And sometimes that's done with a lot of coercion. That's what the railroad lawyers did. There's also the amount of patronage going on, where you're handing out. You'll notice the early Continental Railroad zigzags all over the Midwest, because certain towns would be willing to pay more bribes than others to have the railroad go through there. So instead of going straight across the state, it would take about 5 right turns or left turns. And that was all about patronage.
And some of it was that every once in a while there were those who, when it came to eminent domain, they just could not get them to budge, and they'd have to go, so they'd go around those towns too, and that did happen. So the zigzags are because of both. And I want to add this real quick, because we talk about the railroads and the robber barons and all sort of stuff. And the problem isn't successful businessmen. The problem isn't these big corporations. The problem isn't all of this innovation. The problem was when they were colluding with government, and government were colluding with them, and special rules were being made as a result of that collusion. That's the problem.
Yeah, and if you're these rich guys that require government handouts, you've got every incentive in the world to put your hand-picked people in office. And that's where we get the corrupt Washington, D.C.
And you may not even require government handouts, but you're sure not going to complain about them.
Amen to that.
Interesting enough about those Lincoln-Douglas debates, it was for Illinois governor, if I believe, and Douglas won the election, not Lincoln.
Right. This is a senatorial.
Senatorial.
Senate, yeah.
So that brings us up to, Ron brought us right where we need. Okay, before we jump to 1856, the other major issue that they're debating over was that fundamental, what is going to be the nature of our government? The South is finding that the North really wants a stronger central government, a national government. The South still wants to be a federalist society. You remember
state sovereignty is a big deal. States' rights.
And the name, there's a reason they would call it the Articles of Confederation. I mean, we had the Articles of Confederation, and then they came out and they called it the Federation, the Confederate States. It's all about being federal, and that's different than being
about
national.
being Confederate, actually.
Yeah. We don't need to. We could nitpick the difference, but
tomato.
Little, yeah. So here we get to 1856. And something happens. The Republican Party is founded. They kind of came from the Whigs. They weren't necessarily founded on being against slavery, although that was a part of the platform, a smaller part. The biggest thing they cared about was they were the Buchanan presidency, Democrat presidency from 1857 to 1860 was one of the most corrupt in American history. These Democrats were handing out favors to their people all over the world, or all over the country. It was a very, there's no doubt that their complaint about the Democrats being corrupt were correct. And that was really the main impetus for the Republican Party to form. And you can see here in their first election of 1856, they were able to get 20 seats in the Senate and 94 in the House. And again, this is a party from the North, which is the more populist, but there are Northern Democrats still. We get to the election of 1859, or 1858 election, took office in 1859, and the Republicans are getting closer and actually take a majority in the House. This brings us to the great election of 1860. Now,
and real quick, before you get going too far here, I wanted to go back to the Whigs for a second. The Whig Party was the alternative to Andrew Jackson. They considered Andrew Jackson to be a monarch-minded kind of dictator. They called him King Andrew, and they fought, saying that they were more constitutional. They were more in line with Jefferson. However, when John Tyler becomes president, he is so strictly adheres to the United States Constitution, and the Whig parties, and this is something we were talking about earlier, are pushing for internal improvements paid for the federal government, and he's vetoing them all. And they got so angry that they literally threw him out of the party. So he actually began his presidency as a Whig and finished it as an independent. And so when you see the Whigs, as time passes after that, become more and more of a national government type party, they basically become what they hated originally, or what they said they hated. So now what happened with the Whigs is now you've got a battle over pro-slavery, anti-slavery. So where did the anti-slavery Whigs that now believe in a national government go? They went to the new Republican Party in 1854. So you've got a Whig big government attitude that was willing to throw somebody out of the party over it, now taking the helm in this new party that's going up against Jackson. And of course, then the other Whigs went to the Democratic Party. So you have two parties now that have a foundation that the federal government reigns supreme. They can perform internal improvements. It doesn't matter. The states don't have a right to argue. And even though technically in one case Andrew Jackson was right, but a energetic president that's going to do as he pleases. Trail of Tears being a great example of that. He was sued. The court said you can't do that, and he said, "Well, John Marshall's made my decision. Let's see him enforce it." And then Andrew Jackson did it anyway, and he set a precedent for both parties as we went into the second half of the 19th century of strong controlling president and a centralized federal government with centralized powers. And so it's not a surprise when we went into the Lincolnian era that we saw this national government type of attitude also following him in. So
elections back then were a little different than they are today. You didn't necessarily vote for candidates, you voted for a party.
Yeah. And the Electoral College was still mixed up. Some of the states, it was based on how the people voted. Some of them, they still did it the old way, where the people and the states appointed their electors.
Yeah. So what would happen is, let's say you're the Republican Party, and you've got all your Republican candidates on the ballot. You'll basically print a bunch of blue ballots, and you'll pass them out among all the different states. And the Democrat Party would do the same, and all the factions would print their own ballots. I bring this up because there's a lot of historians will tell you that the South worked really hard to keep Lincoln off the ballot. Well, no, that didn't happen. There was no state ballot to keep him off. That just means the Republican Party chose not to bother to go print in states where Lincoln had no chance of winning. Republicans were not going to win in South Carolina. Why bother wasting the paper and the ink? The other key part about this is that the party would put together their platform, and that's what you'd really be voting on. And they were pretty short and succinct. We didn't have mass communication back then. Everything was done by pamphlets for the most part. I want to show the geography. Well, first of all, we had four major parties in the 1860 election, and I'm going to tell you who they are and then show you the geography because I think it matters. We already know the results. Lincoln won, but you have
in line with what you're saying real quick, too, is something else shifted. Because you voted the man, and you voted for president, you voted for a vice president. But because it was shifting to voting for party, you also began to vote more so for a team, president, vice president, rather than the individual ballots. And that kind of had been shifting over the last 30 to 40 years as well, to the point where by the time the Republican Party was established, you didn't vote for an individual president and vice president anymore. It was a team for the party. And that was also kind of fed into this party versus party rather than the man.
And make no mistake, the elections and politics in the 1800s were even much dirtier even than we have today.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you could say that.
I mean, we could talk about the know-nothings and the stuff they did. Know-nothings were young pro-Republican people in the Midwest, and they were raining terror on elections. But there's
well, they would actually, one of the schemes that was found out about is what they would do is they would take an immigrant who didn't know much, and they would get him drunk and then take him to polling places in different towns. They would change his hat each time so people might not recognize him, to have him vote in all these different towns, just lead him to all these, stuff like that.
Yeah, and people talk about our sacred elections. It's ridiculous. We had Tammany Hall. I mean, you name it, everything was going on with the that's not today's topic. Excuse me.
Dirty politics has been there all along.
Yes.
That's what it comes down to.
So 1860, we've got four major factions. You've got the Republican Party, whose candidate is Lincoln from Illinois. You've got the Southern Democrats. Their candidate is John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky. You've got the Northern Democrats, which went by the Democrat Party, and their candidate was Stephen Douglas from Illinois.
That name sounds familiar.
Yeah, same guy. Just B. Lincoln. And the fourth is what was called the Constitutional Union Party, and this guy named John Bell from Tennessee. Now, before I go into the platforms, I think it's important for us to see the geography. So I do have that pulled up. Hang on. Now we all know the results. So I'm not giving away a spoiler here. If I can pull it up. There it is. All right. So this is the election results of 1860. And you see Lincoln in the red all across the top here and all out west. Okay. You had in the green, we had the Southern Democrats all the way across the South. Basically, most of the states that seceded. Constitutional Union came out of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. There's the ones that are stuck right in the middle. And the Constitutional Union of Bell won Missouri. Now, Constitutional Union's platform was interesting. And we'll get to that in 1 second. But the results were interesting. Lincoln won, obviously, with 39.7% of the popular vote and 180 electoral votes. He won 18 states. The next closest with 21.5% of the votes was Stephen Douglas. But if you combine the other three, they basically had about 48% of the vote. Lincoln had 39. And had you combine the Democrat parties, as they were previously, they would have been right on Lincoln's nipping at his heels.
Yeah, I mean, basically everything south of the Mason-Dixon line went Democrat, the three different Democrats, and everything north of the Mason-Dixon line went Republican. But you'll notice, aside from New Jersey, the southern half of New Jersey, aside from Maryland and Delaware, the northern states that were slave states were more moderate in their voting, with Breckinridge being the more radical going further south. And also understand, a lot of people don't recognize this, that, as you look at that map, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, while they were still slave states, they did not secede. They remained with the Union.
Well, Maryland didn't have an opportunity because Lincoln basically jailed all of their legislators so that they couldn't vote on it.
Yeah, there's a discussion to be had about habeas corpus on that one.
Mm-hmm.
And note also, typically when you look at these maps, folks, New Jersey is typically not listed as a slave state. Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri, Tennessee, all those peripheral states will be. But for some reason, they never list New Jersey as a slave state. And New Jersey is actually the last state to let go of its
exactly.
That said, because New Jersey even refused to let go of their slaves after the 13th Amendment was ratified. They just refused. And then finally, it was January 23rd, I believe, after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, when they finally did it. And there was a massive number of 16 slaves that were freed. So, I mean, it wasn't this unbelievably huge population of slaves, but nonetheless, there were slaves in New Jersey during the whole time.
Yeah, that 1860 census I pulled up earlier had 18 slaves in New Jersey. But the point is,
Oh, it was too lower by the time they let them go. Okay, they must
They
have
lost
died.
a couple. Delaware had like 1,800. District of Columbia had 3,200.
Mhm.
And what's interesting, let me just pull this up again real quick, because this shows you why it was such a heated topic. Is let's look at the slavery in the territories at the time.
Arizona would be a big one.
If you go down here to the Arizona wasn't a territory yet. Kansas territory.
Arizona was in dispute. It was actually a part of the New Mexico territory, and but they sided with the Confederacy.
So
Really?
Yes.
The
New Mexico. Well, that's what split New Mexico and Arizona, because Arizona went with the Confederacy and New Mexico went with the North. But they were part of the same territory. So it was actually a battle within the territory.
Wow.
And that's one of the reasons why they wound up splitting as two different territories. But anyway, go ahead.
I'm even more fond of Arizona now.
What's funny is all these territories, the District of Columbia's got the most. And Utah had 29, Nebraska had 15. You see something like Colorado and Washington would have 0.
Well, what about Florida and Arkansas?
Florida was already a state.
Were they okay? Forgive me. When did Florida become a state?
I don't have that memorized.
It was in the
1850s. I don't remember.
It wasn't. Year. Yeah, it wasn't too much. I mean, it was very close to when the War of Northern Aggression occurred, but I don't remember exactly when.
Well, and when I get to Arizona, it wasn't the settlers in Arizona as much as it was the Indians that were siding with the Confederacy. As if when you look it up, it's a fascinating story. But anyway, continue.
Okay. What I want to do, since we know the results, but let's really want to look at the cause, what they were thinking about at the time, is you have to look at their actual platforms. And at the back of the book, The Election of 1860 by Michael Holt, there's some appendices with some wonderful information from the time. And I'm just going to go through and highlight each of the four parties' platforms and what they cared about, and have you guys comment, because I think it's really telling. Okay. Here's the National Democratic Platform. Is that the first one? Yeah, that's Douglas's. These are the Northern Democrats. First thing they say is we want to declare as a platform of principles by the Democratic Convention in Cincinnati in the year 1856. This is where the Democratic Party got together in Ohio and said, these are the things our party believes in. Okay. I can give you a little more information on that if we need to, but I want to go into this a little bit more. Resolved that the Democrat Party will abide by the decisions of the Supreme Court of the United States on the constitutional law. Now, why is this important? Because what you're going to see in these arguments is one side is saying the state legislature is going to determine whether they have slavery or not in the new territories, and the others are saying everyone's got to abide by the Supreme Court. You're also going to hear them talking about citizens, whether born or naturalized, whether they get the same rights and whether the government has to protect them, which goes back to Bleeding or Bloody Kansas. The next big point that the National Democratic Party wanted will ensure the construction of a railroad to the Pacific Coast at the earliest practicable period. They are pushing for a government-funded railroad, internal improvements. Next I have highlighted is that the enactments of state legislatures to defeat the faithful execution of the fugitive slave law are hostile in character. This is a big deal. Doug, tell us why.
Well, wow. What was basically going on was that when the Fugitive Slave Act, what that basically did is it told that it basically allowed for the
captured slaves on the word. Captured slaves had to be returned.
Yeah, but there's a term for it, and that's what I was looking for. But absolutely, and basically, you got to remember that from the southern state's point of view, that person is property, and so that and what's happening is the northern states are refusing to abide by that. They saw it as hostile in character. They saw it as not just, And so they would not defend, they would refuse to send the slaves back. And so from the South's point of view, they're saying, okay, we're seeing northern states not follow the law. They're not abiding by the law, which is unconstitutional. And then we have a federal government that's not enforcing that law. And that's a problem. And I wanted to, and if you don't mind, I want to, and I've got to now do this real quick. I want to share something on screen real quick, because I want to kind of show Ron something that he was kind of asking about, and now I just screwed it up because I lost my map here. Here we go.
Well, he's looking, Ron. I asked you to, when you jumped forward earlier, you were kind of hitting on this period. You had a couple points to make, so jump in right now if you'd like to.
About which one specifically?
Well, we're leading up to the election right now. Just don't go past 1860.
Well, you had, essentially what you had is you had the, you had the South that they didn't want Lincoln, and the South didn't have a Democrat, or the South wanted their own Democrat, the North wanted their own Democrat, and then you had, if I'm not mistaken, it was Tennessee that had they put some guy up, some billionaire guy who
John Bell.
John Bell, and so you essentially what you did is you split the election 4 ways.
Exactly.
And I mean, it's very, very, if I may use the word parliamentarian, it was basically kind of almost a parliamentarian situation at that point. And the North, because the North had the Republican Party, and they were unified under the Republican Party. The North had even. I think what did he get? Like, was it like 39% of the popular vote?
Yeah, 39.7. Like it just yeah. What's interesting, taking you back a step, is John Bell's Tennessee party was called the Constitutional Union Party.
Mm-hmm.
All 3 parties, besides the Republican parties, knew that if the Republican Party won, there would be secession and civil war. There was no doubt in anyone's mind, and we're about to exhibit that when we talk about we look at their platforms.
Right.
Doug, do you find what you wanted?
Yeah. So I taught U.S. history, and so this is the map I created to kind of show you where the allegiances lied. So when you get down to the New Mexico territory, and you'll see the southern third or quarter is kind of a pink. The Confederate States actually claimed that territory, the southern side of those territories. And then the U and the C in Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona was where their allegiances. And Arizona, the Indians in Arizona actually sent personnel to the war to fight with the Confederates. And then all the territories to the north of that, you can see has got blue around them, and they all pretty much remained under Union control. Anyway, so I just wanted to show you that both Oklahoma and Arizona, the Indian population sided with the Confederacy, and that the Confederate States actually claimed the lower third of the New Mexico territory.
Now, why? I'm just curious, why? What was their rationale?
It's funny because there's not a lot of records as to why, other than that they sided. But I believe is because the Indian populations didn't like the way a centralized federal government was intruding on their rights as a sovereign nation, and the South was saying, "Hey, you guys are sovereign like we are. We're going to leave you alone. We're going to, work with you rather than against you." Well, I think that's probably the main reason.
They probably didn't like Andrew Jackson either. So,
no, of course not. Trail of Tears. I mean, Andrew Jackson basically he and his cronies decided that basically anybody who was an Indian needed to be west of the Mississippi, and it didn't matter who said not to. And I included John Marshall's United States Supreme Court, which told them when it came to Georgia and northern Florida, and you can't do that. And he says, well, you've made your decision, so you enforce it. And he did it anyway.
Which in many respects I almost I find reprehensible.
I mean, he was actually technically constitutionally right, though. Courts have no enforcement power over the president, but what he did was.
I mean, he utilized a lot of those same people in his defense of New Orleans when he was during the War of 1812. So it's like, I mean, those people those people helped him, defeat the British at the Battle of New Orleans, and then he basically stabbed him in the back.
Right.
All right.
Okay. So yeah, anyway, I wanted to.
Well, it's interesting, and I don't necessarily like going back. Just kind of a caveat here. I don't like going back and talking negative about the country, but everything that happened in this country is not roses, and there are a lot of people out there who do try to bring up some of these topics, and they're kind of lambasted for it, saying, "Oh, you can't don't talk negatively about the country." Well,
it's like the 11th Amendment, with the Republican Party. We can't talk about it. Well, if they aren't a ally, I'm going to. And when it comes to the country's history, and this is when people say, "Well, the government did this. The United States was a bad guy on this," and I always want to correct them. No, America wasn't, and the government wasn't. It was segments. It was that both sides were represented. It's just like during Obama's presidency, we weren't all Obamaites, and while Trump is president, not everybody is a Trumpite. And so same thing back then. So when something's going on, this collusion going on, or the Trail of Tears or whatever it is, while there are segments of the government, segments of the population, there are certain figures like Andrew Jackson doing these things. That doesn't necessarily represent everybody. So I tend not to try to use those general terms, the country, the government, this group, that group, because there's always that. It's a segment, and we have to remember that. And this eternal struggle between right and wrong, good and evil, constitutional and unconstitutional, it's nothing new.
Yeah, the bigger picture.
I guess the point I was trying to make there is that we have
been the bad guys often, absolutely.
Yeah, but that said, that doesn't mean that we just erase that history. What we have to do is we have to acknowledge it and then learn from it so that we don't repeat it. And I think that's the crucial thing, that a lot of these people that they all they want to do is they want to highlight the negative history of the country, as opposed to understanding that it's not everybody is that way.
Well, it's not just that, but it also goes to this. This is what I tell people when I give presentations. You as an individual, are you wiser today than you were when you were younger? Is it because of all the right decisions you made?
Right.
At the same time, with what Ron's saying, you have other people that basically the official history. The U.S. government wants people to be loyal to it, pay your taxes, go off to war, and things like that. So they have got every incentive to write the history in a manner that sheds the best light on the U.S. government and its history. That's why we grew up all thinking Abraham Lincoln was Honest Abe, and
the Mexican-American War was a war of expansionism.
Yeah, we were taught a sugar-coated version of it. Our job is to really look at the real history, looking at source documents, and say, this is how it really happened. Our history is a lot messier than we're told.
Yeah, right. Original documents, source documents, and that's just it right there. Any good historian, that's what they're going to do. They're not going to take the word, and that's the reason why I get upset on certain issues. There's a very popular pundit, for example, Mark Levin on TV, and I love him. He's right most of the time, and then he misrepresented the 1898 Wong Kim Ark. I know it's not the place to get into that issue, but he misrepresented. Says, well, it was just a bad decision. No, it wasn't. You didn't read it. You got to go back to the original document. Don't take the word of other people. And that's unfortunately what happens. That's why things like birthright citizenship and all that, they're able to completely survive, is because people are just listening to the last guy.
Well, and that's where you get crap like the 1619 Project from.
Oh yeah, or the fact that Ty Cobb was a horrible person. But anyway,
right. All right. So this book was written by Michael Holt. In the foreword, he addresses that specifically.
Okay.
When he was given the assignment,
I have the book, but I haven't read it yet. So now you've just encouraged me to read my book.
In the foreword, he said he was given the assignment. He's retired. He was, but one of his old friends asked him, "We need a new version of Lincoln," and Lincoln's one of the most written about people in history. So he decided to go back and approach it from a different direction, and he went back and found newspaper articles from every small town leading up to the 1860 election, and formed his whole story from those small town and bigger town newspaper articles, source documents, and that's where he got his conclusion. That's why he came up with. That's why I think it's such a valuable book.
Yeah, and that's how we found out Ty Cobb was not as hated as he thought was newspaper clippings.
All right, going back into these platforms. All right, they talked about.
Got to throw baseball in at one point.
Hey, there you're talking my language. It's spring training.
All right, go ahead, Warhamster.
Next thing highlighted, imposed by the federal constitution on the power of territorial legislature over the subject of domestic relations. That's the same thing. He wants to make sure that their Cincinnati platform, it basically is during the existence of territorial governments, the measure of restriction imposed by the Constitution is basically talking about giving the territorial legislatures their due power and not being overruled by this court. The National Democratic Platform, those are the Southern Democrats, which is Breckinridge. Again, they want to adopt a platform adopted at Cincinnati. He talked about that the territory, organized by an act of Congress, is provisional and temporary, and during its existence, all citizens of the United States have an equal right to settle with their property in the territory without their rights either of person or property. I'll let Doug tell why I emphasize property, because you mentioned it earlier.
Once again, he's talking about slaves, and from a South's point of view, a slave is the property of whoever owns them. And the idea was, well, if somehow that property makes its way into the North, then that piece of property is suddenly a free human being. It's funny because Dred Scott argued against that, said, no, just because you're in the North doesn't suddenly make you free. You're still property. I mean, that's like me, having my suitcase, and then I go into some other state and they say, well, you can't own your suitcase anymore. Well, no, it's still mine. And so that's why that was key. That was one of the arguments by the South. Now, obviously, the arguments by the South, there was many of them. It was multifaceted, and slavery was one component of a much larger machine and larger complaint. So we have to keep that in mind. That said, slavery was a component, and the importance of the North not being able to stomp on somebody's property rights was important, and they saw that as a natural right. Your property belongs to you. It's none of the government's business about your possessions. That's the way they looked at it. Whether or not as a person, if you set the slavery part aside, that makes all the sense in the world. What I own, what I have in my house, what I decide to buy and purchase and keep inside that's my business. None of your business, government. Mm-hmm. That's my possession, my property.
Ron, you got anything?
No, that's another thing that we need to realize is that our perception of how slavery was in the South really today is shaped more by Hollywood than it is by reality. I was going through Abbeville Institute, and there was an interesting article written by a guy, Massimo or something, whatever. I forget his name, but he talked about how there definitely was a separation of the races. They understood that, but because the white people and the black people in the South were almost it was kind of almost a 50-50 proposition. They all worked the land together. They had to figure everything out together. So in a sense, they needed each other, and they had a level of respect for one another that did not exist in the North. And so the institution of slavery, as we understand it by the history books today, is a gross misinterpretation of what actually happened in the Southern states. And I truly believe that I don't mean to get ahead, but I truly believe that the war, the invasion that Lincoln did in the South actually caused a greater harm to the slaves than it did than benefit. But anyway,
it needs to be said. It needs to be said that there were many black slaves and free blacks that fought on the side of the Confederacy, mm-hmm. and that after the emancipation, there was a significant number of former slaves that stayed on at the same property doing the exact same thing. The only difference is they got a paycheck. They lived in the same quarters. They, ate in the same location with the same food. I mean, nothing changed other than that they got a paycheck.
And another thing is that slavery was dying already.
Well, Okay.
But all right. I guess I'm probably touching on something that you don't want me to touch on. So I'll shut
No,
up.
it's okay. But that statement that slavery was dying is only partially correct. It was dying in part of the South and very healthy in others. Virginia, it was already fading out. In the Deep South, it was totally thriving at this point in time. It took
but they did recognize that even there, eventually it would, because innovation and economics had the writing was on the wall.
It was going to be eventual, but it was not going to happen quickly in the Deep South.
Right. And so then the question becomes, as it's dying and as things are changing, do we want the federal government to dictate to us how to handle that, or we want to be able to handle that the way we want to individually and decide when it's time to make the change?
Very good. Jumping back in, the next one I've highlighted is they're talking about when these new unions get organized, they ought to be admitted to the federal union, whether its constitution prohibits or recognizes the institution of slavery. Again, it's to the South's benefit. The new territories have slavery because they'd be their political allies. They're trying to make it, this is our party, that the state itself gets to determine their slave laws.
And let's understand something else. Slavery was changing, not because it might be dying out, but also because the land had been worked in the South so much that it was becoming harder and harder to have good crops. And so they were looking for fertile land. And if they were to remain to the south of the southern border of Missouri, as the Missouri Compromise had originally intended, those lands were basically desert lands, Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. And in order to keep, because remember, the South was all about agriculture. Slavery was a byproduct of that agriculture, but agriculture was the big deal. And so they needed more slave states in more fertile lands so that the farmers could move to those fertile lands with their workforce, which were the slaves. And the fertile lands were Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and places like that. And so it also, this is the reason why what you read a moment ago about, the state deciding was important, is because they wanted that fertile land for the slave states, for agriculture, because agriculture was struggling because the land didn't have the same nutrients, so on and so forth. They didn't have the technologies we have today. And so it was as much a fight for fertile land as it was anything else.
Well, and another thing that people need to realize is that at the time, cotton was essentially it was the oil of the day.
Sure.
We didn't have you didn't have the oil industry. You had the cotton industry, and the world relied upon the cotton industry.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Confederacy was producing what was it, like 80 to 90% of the cotton supply that the world used. So it was extraordinarily cotton was an enormous deal.
All right,
and
we're getting back on topic. I agree, but we're rabbit trailing a little bit too much.
Okay, my apologies.
No,
I think it's important for context, though.
Oh, absolutely.
No, it's Doug's fault. He wants to get full detail, but I want to litigate that another time.
All right, no problem.
Well, that's a dangerous part about this topic. 'Cause it's very easy to start getting into.
Because it's not a single item, single component issue, as certain people out there want to make it. It's just about slavery. There were so many factors, and that's really, I think, what this little rabbit trail is all about, is to show how many factors that it was more than just slavery.
Mm-hmm.
All right, continuing. They talk about the fugitive slave law as hostile. If they defeat the faithful execution, it's hostile in character. The language is great. They talk about the democracy of the U.S. It is imperative duty of this government to protect the naturalized citizens and all his rights, whether at home and foreign lands, to the same as its native-born citizens. I think that's about slave rights, slave property again. Down here at the bottom, they talk about they want the construction of a Pacific Railroad from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean at the earliest.
Yeah, the Northern Railroad had already been built. The Southern Railroad, there was all kinds of issues, and it was partly because of this, what was going on.
Yeah. So here we have the Constitutional Union, Bell Everett platform. And these were the ones who wanted to preserve the Union at any cost. Well, they said, whereas experience has demonstrated that platforms adopted by the partisan conventions of the country have had the effect to mislead and deceive the people and at the same time to widen the political divisions of the country by the creation and encouragement of geographical and sectional parties.
That's another way of saying the two-party system's killing us.
Yep, exactly. They say that this part of patriotism, where we recognize no political principle other than the Constitution of the country, the union of the states, and the enforcement of the laws. They talk about separately and unitedly. They talk about believing that thereby peace may once more be restored to the country. And that's really what this whole party was about, preservation of the Union. It's an anti-Lincolnian message because everybody knew that Lincoln was, if he got elected, the Republican parties took power, the South would be forced to secede.
Yeah, that's right.
And here we get to the Republican Party, Lincoln's party, and it says that the history of the nation during the last 4 years has fully established the propriety and necessity of the organization and perpetuation of the Republican Party, and that the causes which called it into existence are permanent in their nature, and now more than ever before demand its peaceful and constitutional triumph.
Boy, talk about it all being about party.
Uh-huh. Then they go on to maintain the principles promulgated in the Declaration of Independence and embedded in the Constitution that all men are created equal, etc. It's essential to the preservation of our Republican institutions. Then he goes down a little further on. They say, when we hold in abhorrence all schemes for disunion, come from whatever source they may, and we congratulate the country that no Republican member of Congress has uttered or countenanced the threats of disunion so often made by Democratic members without rebuke and with applause from their political associates, and we denounce those threats of disunion.
You know, it's interesting because it reminds me of today's politics. No, we want to hold the union together, even though we're the ones forcing the others away. But we won't say that. We'll say we're all about keeping it together, even though we're pushing them away. Exactly right. It's the famous talking out of both sides of your mouth situation.
And they're basically saying you are a scoundrel for even suggesting that secession is legal.
Well, and they would go on to say it's insurrection and treason.
Yeah, and it's such an important part. If we skip ahead to after the war, why the 14th Amendment came in and they talked about insurrection, they needed to justify Lincoln's actions from an ethical standpoint. That absolutely was the case. But everybody knew that secession was legal. We go back to the 1815 Hartford Convention. It was so legal that the Congress in 1860 and 61 tried 3 times to pass a law making secession illegal. And you're not going to do that if it wasn't already legal.
Right.
Right. Well, and I just like to say something, and I don't mean to be getting ahead of myself, but I do believe that Lincoln, the assassination of Lincoln, actually was the worst thing to happen for the South. But that's
because he wanted to at least deal with them in a fair manner and allow them to return to the Union without disgrace and so on and so forth.
Right.
Which is something that Andrew Johnson tried to carry on, but the Lincolnian Republicans, which were really nationalistic Republicans in the Congress, they wanted to punish the South the full extent of their ability.
Mm-hmm. Well, and he was impeached for it.
Yeah, and his vetoes were overridden over and over and over.
But anyway, I didn't mean to digress, but you all know that I'm no fan of Lincoln, but at the same time, I have to give credit where credit is due, and I do believe that his assassination was the worst thing that could have happened for the South.
Well, it's funny because he was so unconstitutional in a lot of his actions, but like I said, he wanted to, at least as the Southern states were trying to come back into the Union, be as fair and easy and quick about it as he could. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Going on.
Sorry there, Warhamster. Didn't mean to go down a rabbit hole.
No, it's okay. From time to time, we can do quick rabbit trails.
So could we call those run droppings? Anyway, all right, go ahead.
Touche.
That the present Democratic administration has far exceeded our worst apprehensions in its measureless subserviency to the exactions of a sectional interest, as especially evinced in its desperate exertions to force the infamous Lecompton Constitution upon the protesting people of Kansas. This is where they are calling out to the country, this Democrat administration that's currently in office of Buchanan has been corrupt, and they need to go. And they cited Bleeding Kansas about it.
Yeah, and you got to remember too that the Lecompton Constitution, what that was the pro-slavery document in 1857 in Kansas that basically was pushing, and it was unofficially official or officially unofficial, but it basically stated that Kansas was pro-slavery, it guaranteed slaveholders the right to own their slaves and their descendants. And it allowed the voters to choose between a constitution with slavery or a constitution without slavery, and it excluded any free blacks from the Bill of Rights. So the Lecompton Constitution was a big deal, and it definitely increased tensions that led to what became the war between the states.
Very good. Continuing. That the people justly view with alarm the reckless, listen to this language, the reckless extravagance which pervades every department of the federal government. Sounds familiar? That a return to rigid economy and accountability is indispensable to arrest the systemic plunder of the public treasury by favored partisans. Calling out the corruption.
Boy, USAID was back. No, never mind.
Exactly. Says that here it comes. Number 7, they get to slavery. That the new dogma that the Constitution of its own force carries slavery into any or all of the territories of the United States is a dangerous political heresy. Their position is no more slavery in the territories, and that's really the line in the sand.
Mm-hmm. But here's the thing: the reason why they mentioned the Constitution there is the argument was the Constitution gives the federal government no authority to dictate which way a territory goes. However, it does. Congress is given the authority over all the rules over a territory, and so it's up to the federal government. And it's not up to the government to determine if a state has slavery, but it is up to the federal government to determine if a territory has slavery. And that was the battle.
Just to wrap this up, we deny Congress the authority of Congress of a territorial legislature. He said that we brand the recent reopening of the African slave trade under the cover of our national flag, aided by perversions of judicial power, as a crime against humanity. Okay. That's what I said earlier. The African slave trade had reopened to some degree.
Well, it was reopened by certain factions in the from the South, but it was never officially recognized as being reopened.
Yeah, and they're calling it out. Mm-hmm. It says that in recent vetoes by the federal governors of the acts of the legislatures of Kansas and Nebraska prohibiting slavery in those territories, we find a practical illustration of the boasted democratic principle of non-intervention and popular sovereignty embodied in the Kansas-Nebraska bill, and a demonstration of the deception and fraud involved within. We could probably dedicate an entire episode or two just to that whole Kansas issue.
Right. That actually might not be a bad thing, because there's so few people who know about Bleeding Kansas, and I mean that was a crazy time. Now, forgive me if I'm getting it wrong. That was Dodge City and Wyatt Earp. That was well before his time. Yes.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, well before.
Okay, so I highlighted this one in purple because it's a real big one. That while providing revenue for the support of the general government by duties upon imports, sound policy requires such an adjustment of those imposts as to encourage the development of the industrial interest of the whole country. That's what we're talking about with internal improvements. They want to tax everybody to fund the industrialization. That includes steel. Again, we talked about canals earlier, railroad, etc. This is the mercantilism clause.
Yeah, nothing will happen without the federal government. You didn't build that.
You didn't build that. I love that dig there, Doug. That was great.
Okay, then this is a fun one, that the Republican Party is opposed to change in our naturalization laws or any legislation by the rights of citizenship hitherto accorded to immigrants from blah, blah, blah. This is a natural born citizen. We dealt with this a lot. Another big one in purple. That appropriations by Congress for river and harbor improvements of a national character required by the accommodation and security of an existing commerce are authorized by the Constitution. Where are they authorized?
The ports are mentioned when it comes to the necessary and proper clause, and that's where they're using it. And if And if they can improve and hold and control over the port, then that means they can improve and hold the control over the waters surrounding it, and then the waters beyond that, and it just progresses and progresses and progresses.
This next one's interesting, that a railroad to the Pacific Ocean is imperatively demanded by the interest of the whole country. And then they get down here and they talk about a daily overland mail should be promptly established. I talked about the corruption of the railroad lawyers and that whole process. But the postmasters in the 1800s were very corrupt. You could give out favors of patronage like you wouldn't believe. I mean, this is a stepping stone political position. You get to be postmaster, you can become a governor, congressman, but the postmasters controlled a lot of political favors.
Absolutely.
Right. You better not mess with any of the post roads, or you will be accused of a federal crime, and you're going to rot. How dare you? How dare you look under the skirt of their corruption in the postal system? Once again, more things change, but they stay the same.
I was just you're reading my mind there, Doug.
Well, we went through this exercise because I think it makes a ton of sense to understand what were the actual issues that led them to secede. Obviously, Lincoln wins. We're not going to, I guess maybe we'll read the preamble of the Confederate Constitution before we go today. But I wanted to read one other thing that really gives you an idea of what they cared about. And this comes from what's called a Report on the Committee of Foreign Affairs. And this was done on September 4th, 2014. And this was a Confederate document when they'd already formed their Constitution. But I know this is jumping ahead, but I think it's worth reading. The real issue involved in the relations between the North and South of the American states is the great principle of self-government. Shall a dominant party of the North rule the South, or shall the people of the South rule themselves? This is the great matter in controversy. After the lapse of 84 years, this party of the North set up the same pretension the British Parliament claimed over our ancestors in 1776. That's the attitude of many in the South.
Yeah, they saw the federal government and the North as being no different than King George.
Right. And they weren't too far off.
No.
And today, there's a lot of people would say the same thing about the federal government, or at least under the hands of certain individuals prior to this presidency. So
Lincoln gets elected. Shortly thereafter, South Carolina says, we're out of here. That's December 20th, 1860. They'd be followed shortly there by Mississippi in January 9th, Florida on January 10th, Alabama January 11th, Georgia January 19th, Louisiana January 26th, and Texas on February 1st. Then they meet and they get together and they sign the Confederate Constitution.
And then after hostilities begin, then you have a few more states that wind up also seceding, like Arkansas.
So the Confederate Constitution is ratified on March 11th, 1861. So pretty quickly. And when we get into it, you'll see why it was so easy, because they basically had a really good blueprint to start from and just made some tweaks around the edges. But as Doug just said, shortly thereafter, we've got the issue at Fort Sumter. We don't need to relitigate who fired the first shot. In fact, that nobody died there. Gave Lincoln his excuse to declare war. Immediately, Virginia, by April 17th, Virginia secedes. Arkansas joins in May. North Carolina on May 20th, and then Tennessee on June 8th. And that was your South.
Do you know why Fort Sumter was one of the main targets?
Go ahead.
Because that was one of the main places where the federal government collected their tariff money.
And another thing to point out here is you notice that Virginia was one of the states that didn't secede till after everything got going. And a lot of people, especially the 1619 Project, will claim that Virginia was this, and they'll paint him as the leader of the Confederacy, blah, 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 because, the Confederate capital was in Richmond. Well, the Confederate capital was originally in Montgomery, Alabama. It wasn't up there. It didn't happen until later because that's where the concentration of what was going on was, and that's where they needed a lot of the troops and a lot of the personnel and so on and so forth. Virginia wasn't the harbinger of the Confederacy as things like the 1690 Project make it. And let's not forget that in the 1820s, when Virginia had its constitutional convention, they almost voted slavery out of the state.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Virginia they had a real strong belief in the doctrines of state rights.
Right.
That goes back to, and that's really the point we want.
Well, that's the state of Jefferson and Madison and George Mason and so forth.
Yeah, what happened is Lincoln, after Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls for the troops, and a bunch of Virginians say, "No, we're not doing this," including Lee, who initially did not want secession.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it wasn't until Lincoln called up the troops to attack the South.
Right.
And he did that. He did that without when he called up the 75,000 troops, he did that without a declaration of war from Congress, and he actually told Congress to stay away.
Now, he not only did it without declaration of Congress, he also did it without Congress calling them into the actual service of the United States. Because you got to realize back then, the Army was actually very small. Most of what we had from the Union Army they were not federalized. It was basically the militia still, and the militia, or what today we might call the National Guard, but constitutionally, Article 1, Section 8, that has to be called up by Congress, and he called them in action without Congress's involvement. Also,
right.
So, and the reason why there was no declaration of war, it's argued, is because it was wayward states, not another country. Of course, I argue the opposite. They were a country. They had declared their nationhood. They had declared themselves as the Confederate States of America. It was a different country, and he did, with those troops, invade a whole different country.
Yeah, it was not a civil war, because a civil war means fighting over the seat of power of a sovereign nation. That is not what happened.
It was two entities fighting for control of one thing.
But they had to make it a civil war in order for it to be insurrection and treason.
That's how they had to. It was one slave-holding federal republic fighting another slave-holding federal republic, and it was a war of conquest. They wanted to enforce the national government and the national will upon you at the point of a bayonet.
Right.
Now,
well, and just real quick, just to kind of elaborate upon the point about Lincoln and some of the stuff that he did, he actually, I don't remember what the 4 traps were, but he actually had 4 places set, like traps to be sprung to push the South to firing the first shot. One of them was at Fort Sumter, and then there was 3 others throughout the South. I don't remember exactly where they were. Sam Maxwell talks about it in his book called "It Wasn't About Slavery," but I just didn't look that up.
And even after the election, secession was not inevitable. They still could have compromised. The Crittenden Compromise was on Lincoln's desk, and he ordered his Republican Party not to compromise.
I think you're right in the sense that the South wasn't necessarily dead set on secession, but I think the North was dead set on forcing them to pay the tariffs, because that was their their money.
They needed it. They needed it to get the internal improvements. There was the railroad money is what they wanted.
It was essentially corporate welfare. It was basically what it was. It was just corporate welfare.
Little did they know, and I know I'm jumping ahead here, but little did they know on the horizon was silver in Nevada. But we'll talk about that later.
So we've kind of set the table for the Confederate Constitution, and what we're going to find is, as we go through it, is the Confederate Constitution is much less of a national government, and it's a turn back towards federalism and states' rights. Now, I've made the argument that when the war sprung out, Lincoln immediately nationalized the government and turned it into a machine with all central power. Took away all states' rights. Started, printed money. The greenbacks were basically just a fiat currency. All these things you do to nationalize a government and get a stronger central government is really good for winning wars. It's not really good for having a long-term peaceful existence with states' rights and protecting our natural rights and everything like that. The Confederacy did the opposite, and it made it very difficult for them to wage war to the same degree as the North, which had more population.
That is true. That is absolutely true. In fact, I would argue that the Confederate States needed a stronger constitution like the United States Constitution was for centralized authority to win the war. And then what they could have done is once they had won the war, then they could go back and mold it the way that they needed to. But in order to effectively fight the war, they really should have had. So I remember, not that I'm a big fan of Ken Burns, but he very accurately got in there that it was. I mean, I think the Georgia was debating seceding from the Confederacy because they thought that the governor actually thought that the Confederate government was overstepping its bounds, and
and because it was a Confederate government, that's actually doomed it from the very beginning when it came to the war. Because what was happening is the same thing that was happening with the militias during the American Revolution. Mm-hmm. States will say, "No, we're not going to deploy our troops over there." And and so the lack of any central control or enough central control, should I say, is actually what doomed them from the beginning. When it comes to war, there needed to be more central control, and that's the reason. The only reason why we pulled off the American Revolution was because George Washington was finally given that central control kind of role. When you've got as the old saying goes, too many chiefs and not enough Indians, right, you're not going to win a war. And that doomed the Confederacy from the very beginning.
Correct.
Yeah. An autocratic government is going to be better at some things. And we always talk about big government is really good at two things. And one is killing people, and the other is collecting our taxes. So stealing and killing. So that's what.
Well, if I've always said killing and breaking things, but anyway,
to your point there, War Hamster. In terms of autocratic government, with bringing it home to modern day, you look at the power that the executive holds. I would argue that the power is extraordinarily autocratic in many respects, and I that's one of the reasons why I'm semi-hopeful for our current situation that we will get through this much faster, just because of the autocratic nature that Trump has, the ability to do things. But all that power was ceded to the executive by either the legislative or the judicial for the purposes of having somebody in there with the amount of power that Trump has, but it wasn't supposed to be Trump.
Yeah, that's pretty pretty good closing thought. I guess next week we'll jump into the Confederate Constitution itself. But this is a pretty good, table setting for it. You guys have anything else? You guys want to add anything else before we tune out?
No, that's I'm good.
Gibbs.com.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You find me at untoldhistory.tv. Takes you right to my Rumble channel, untoldhistory.tv.
Yep, and I'll have all these links in the description of the video on my channel. And
I'm one last thing. I'm on Twitter as I think it's REPJ1969. That's my primary Twitter handle, or X handle.
I'll put that in the comments as well. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Everyone, thanks for watching. Have a happy Valentine's Day, and cheers. See you soon.
Absolutely.